Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. In history classes across the country, you will hear students proclaim, "Why do we need to learn about dead people?" To which teachers will respond, "You either learn from history or you are doomed to repeat it." While this may seem like an innocuous conversation, it does raise an even more pertinent issue: how to make learning history more exciting and engaging. Nonfiction books and documentaries, while obviously important to document important moments, usually do not have the flair and excitement of fiction books and movies, no matter how many Ken Burns effects you use. As a result, authors have turned to historical fiction, a kind of blending of the genres of documentary and fiction. But while the story becomes more exciting and engaging, care has to be taken to remain true to the original story and the facts of a given situation. This is where today's guests excel. The new book, The Thread Collectors, has been named by BookBub as one of the best historical fiction books of 2022. To talk about the importance of teaching history and the art of making history alive, today we welcome the authors of The Thread Collectors, Alyson Richman and Shaunna J. Edwards. Ladies, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you for having us.
Explain to our listeners, if you can, just what historical fiction is and the role that it can play in our classrooms.
Well, historical fiction is a genre in novel writing that basically the author's responsibility is to do a tremendous amount of historical research to create the backdrop of which the characters that are invented, their lives will unfold. So it's sort of a hybrid way of storytelling. There, you do this a very in-depth harvesting of facts and understanding of that period of history, but you also want to make it come alive. And the way it best comes alive, I think, is creating characters in which the reader really is rooting for. It's important to make sure that the character expresses, these universal emotions that we all experience, whether it's in 1863 or it's in 2022. So think about those universal things that do connect us all. The need to love, the sense to grieve when we have loss, the need to protect our children. How does one put food on the table when, there's a certain political crisis happening, whether it's the Civil War or whether it's just, poverty in general? How does a mother feed her children? These are themes that are always prevalent in history. But the backdrop changes, with historical fiction. You can write a novel that takes place in World War II. You could take it in the Civil War, the dirty wars in South America. There's all sorts of different landscapes that you can place characters against. But I think the intention when writing historical fiction is to make sure that the reader learns something that they didn't know when they first embarked on that particular read.
I understand that you have a lot of experience writing nonfiction books. You've written a lot of bestsellers in the past. And I know, Ms. Edwards, this is your first foray into this particular genre. So what brought the two of you together to actually write this book?
Well, that's a great question. This is definitely a dream come true for me. The Thread Collectors is my debut novel, but I have been a longtime reader and lover of words. I was a literature major at college at Harvard, and I thought about majoring in history, frankly, but I thought history was the province of frankly, jocks, people that knew a lot of dates and knew when the Magna Carta was, and I didn't feel that I knew that. I knew stories. I now understand, however, history is just the weaving together of a lot of individual stories, and so I can call myself now a historical fiction novelist. But we got together in one of the more unlikeliest of places, Las Vegas. I am a former corporate lawyer, and we met at a lawyer's boondoggle. Her husband is a lawyer, and I saw this woman, and she was letting a lot of men cut in front of her at the line at the bar. And I walked up to her and I said, "Why are you letting all these men cut in line? And also, I love your dress." Mm-hmm. And we got to talking, and she told me that she is a writer. And my eyes lit up, right? Because I was like, wow, you're the person here I want to speak to. I don't want to speak to these other dusty lawyers. I want to speak to someone who every day goes and uncovers these facts that are forgotten and puts them on the page. And that sparked a years-long friendship, decades-long friendship, where we would just talk about books that she was writing, books that I was reading, and just stories. But I don't want to steal the plot line, so I'll let Alyson tell you, if we come to it, how we conceived of the Thread Collectors together. But it really was that first spark of like seeing a kindred soul across a crowded room and starting that conversation about words.
It's true. And I have to just say, from my, vantage point, like, you can see how beautiful and smart my co-author Shaunna is. And so there was this instant magnetic attraction to being with someone who was so alive and so curious, and so intelligent. And you don't meet people like that every day. It's a rare occurrence. And so, especially in a sea of dusty lawyers, this like sparkling jewel sort of emerged. And we just sort of, instantly bonded. And Shaunna became a lifelong friend of mine. We just made a vow that we would start seeing each other in New York. And even when she went and she's transferred to a new job in DC, we always kept in touch. I remember at one point I was actually sick, and she sent me, 2 books to cheer my spirits. Our friendship was always cemented in our shared love of literature. And so it just became part of our friendship that we would, if I was working on a book, she would always ask me about it, and I would start talking about it, and she would start contributing her thoughts and her reactions to what the theme might be. So in 2017, Shaunna was working in DC. She came up, for a meeting in New York. We met for drinks, and I shared with her that I had just seen a very interesting documentary on PBS. It was called Death in the Civil War. It was done by Rick Burns. Ken Burns, I think it's his younger brother. And it was a fascinating documentary where I learned so many things that I had not been aware of. One was that, 180,000 Black men enlisted in the Union Army. That's a formidable number when you think about it. I mean, just to put it in perspective, as we mentioned, I do have in my family tree 2 great uncles who fought on opposite sides in the Civil War, but there were only 8,000 Jewish soldiers who fought in the Civil War, including both sides. So the fact, when you look at that number of 180,000 Black men fighting for freedom, it's an incredible number. But what the documentary exposed or spotlighted was the fact that these men who had taken great risks to themselves to enlist and to escape slavery, they were, not given muskets when they joined up. They were given pickaxes and hoes, and they were forced to do manual labor. They were not, allowed on the battlefield later they would in certain episodes that we talk about in our book. But a lot of the times they were forced also to bury the white Union soldiers that had fallen on the battlefield. And another aspect of the documentary was the fact that maps were sometimes created because men had to be so quickly buried. There was always the person who might have had a special friendship with one of his, comrades, that he wanted to make sure that there was a document that might enable the family to find where their beloved had been buried. So I instantly had this flash of sort of connecting those 2 episodes in the documentary of, wouldn't it be interesting if there was an unexpected friendship between a Black Union soldier and a white Union soldier, and a Black Union soldier takes the initiative to create a map that will lead the widow of a fallen white soldier back to her beloved. And so I said that to Shaunna. I said, it's just a rough idea. And, I've always also wanted to incorporate my own family tree, knowing that there were 2 brothers who fought against opposite sides in the Civil War. So maybe that could be part of the novel. But I was literally just throwing things out over, ideas over a glass of wine. And Shaunna right away was like, what if the Black soldier eventually takes the map that he's created with, paper and pencil, and gives it to his beloved, who is able to preserve it using repurposed cloth and thread. And she started telling me about, the African-American tradition of creating family heirlooms using, with quilts, with using, dresses that are made into quilts, things that become artifacts of history in order to preserve them. And of course, I immediately thought that was a brilliant idea. And it opened up so many things, not just bringing in the tradition of preserving things that have value and family history or of importance to you, but also this sense that it could be a love story. Like, well, who is his beloved who's able to make this map? And it just sort of seemed like an incredible idea.
Speaking of history's going on all around us. I think when we all lived through May and June and July of 2020 against the backdrop of the pandemic and the brutal murder of George Floyd, that's something that, 20 years from now, there will be whole chapters and textbooks and books about what the climate of the nation was. I had just recently transferred into a role where my full-time job was helping a large global organization with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So every day I'm living this kind of sense of how do you take these historical wrongs and somehow currently make it right? When Alyson called me and she said, I think now is the time for this book, my first instinct, Kevin, as much as I love words and love ideas and love research, wasn't, yes, let's write it, because I had to figure out if I had the bandwidth to not only live in the current racially divisive climate, but also delve back into the past. And one thing I will say about Alyson is she is the hardest working woman in show business. When I say that she loves historical fiction, I mean, she does the research, she walks the streets. And I knew that I would have to have that same level of integrity. I would have to go and stand on the battlefields and read the original documents. And that takes emotional labor. And so I did not know if I could do it. But after speaking with my then fiance, now husband, it came to me that this might actually be exactly what I needed, a place to put all of that pain and uncertainty of what was going on in 2020 and is still going on today. Read about history to try to make sense of it, because if you can get through the Civil War onto the other side, then we can get through this and create something of beauty with a very dear friend. So the history for me was a way to grapple with the present.
Everything you said, there's a lot to unpack there, because you talk about the history or the tradition of quilting, and how in the African tradition, you take a story and you kind of preserve it for all perpetuity by building these elaborate quilts, and how the quilts tell the story and they become very beautiful and so forth. And I guess that was kind of the reason for the title of the book. But before you answer that question, the question I want to get into is, I can hear in the way that you're telling this story right now how much of an emotional journey this probably was for both of you. Again, family histories included, and trying to link past and present and so forth. So how did you decide just how far back to pull the curtain, so to speak, to reveal parts of your own personal lives when writing this book?
So I think from the beginning, we decided our first writing day, if you can believe it, was on Juneteenth, 2020. So we're in Bryant Park, we're lowering our masks, trying to be very careful. And we had to agree to be honest with each other and honest with ourselves. We did not want to whitewash history at all. And Alyson shared with me, for her, she's more comfortable speaking about it now, but in the beginning, it was, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Alyson, embarrassing for her as a Jewish woman that she had a great uncle that fought on the side of the Confederacy. For me, when you're exploring a lot of the different themes of colorism, white adjacency, those are things that have impacted my family, right? Like, there are different branches of my family that look very differently, and some of them have gone out of their way to preserve their fair-skinned nature because they know that it might lead them into greater economic success, greater social success. And these were difficult conversations to have, but I think we said, we're going to be honest with ourselves and we're going to be honest with each other. I don't think anyone's going out of their way to embarrass their families, but if we don't confront what has happened in our own homes, how can we ever expect to move forward as a people, as a nation, as a world?
I tried to find out as much as I could, especially about my Southern relatives while writing this novel. There is something called the Chappelle Foundation, which is a foundation that is trying to archive every Jewish soldier who fought in the Civil War and their stories. And so, or their, at least, the historical aspect of their stories. And so I reached out to them and I said, I have these two great uncles, and I had the regiment numbers. I even knew on the side of the the uncle who fought on the Confederacy, that he ranked in as a sergeant in the 29th Regiment of Mississippi and ranked out as a private. So he was obviously a very bad soldier. And I wanted to know I was hoping that they could reveal to me some episode where he threw down his musket and he wanted to go fight on the Union side. But they could not find out why he had been demoted. He was just a really bad soldier. But I really wanted to know as much as I possibly could. I mean, even learning that the family homestead in Satartia, Mississippi, while they did not have slaves, it was built, it says in a document, it was built by borrowed slaves, So, just trying to be as, raw and honest as I could of what I knew about my own family story, to be able to pull from that to put in the book. I mean, obviously our characters are inventions of our imaginations, but they're also pulled from our hearts and our emotions, and they're complex. We want them to, that they, even the best, heroes have a side of darkness or weaknesses that, and vulnerabilities. And so, doing a novel where there's shades of gray in people's characters is also important to sort of delve into, I think, when writing an emotional novel.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guests today discussing the art of making history alive are Alyson Richman and Shaunna J. Edwards, authors of the historical fiction book, The Thread Collectors. I'm glad you went down that particular road, because how do you really thread the events of today into a story that was set over 150 years ago?
Well, I'll go back to something that Alyson said earlier in our discussion, and that is that our motivations as people haven't changed, right? Love, security, keeping our children safe, having agency and control over our own lives. So while it may seem very different, people are wearing different clothes. I think sometimes people can't imagine what it would have taken to escape slavery. Everyone can imagine what it might be like to have to give your daughter very difficult advice, for instance, about how to survive in the world, how to have to make choices about whether or not you're going to leave a situation that might be good enough, but you think you can create something better. And so those are the themes that I think will resonate, even though they're rooted in historical fact. I'm also a firm believer, and it may just be because I grew up in New Orleans, a city where history is so present, it's around every corner, that you can't escape it. It's right there. There is there's a New York historical episode that we outline in the book, and that is the burning of the Colored Children's Asylum in Manhattan. This was during the draft riots during the Civil War. And this was a really tragic circumstance where there were about 250 Black children in this orphanage, and they were confronted with a mob of hundreds of white men that came to burn them out. Miraculously, they were saved. They were shepherded out of a door, and they even managed to have a Bible that they escaped with that's in the New York Historical Society. But that's on the corner of 43rd and 5th. I actually belong to, as I said, I went to Harvard undergrad. I belong to the Harvard Club, which is at 44th and 5th, which means that, Kevin, I have walked past that corner dozens, if not hundreds of times, not knowing that one of the worst instances of racialized violence in New York State happened right there. And so I think that you have to be able to bring that history and make it present for people. And I think you do that by showing how it intersects with their life, their daily lives.
Alyson?
I feel obviously exactly the same as Shaunna, in the sense of there is so much around us that connects us to the past. And while we might not be aware of, such as the landmark of where the Colored Children's Asylum once stood, we are seeing racialized violence every day. I mean, it happens all the time, and it's horrific. And so when writing a book like The Thread Collectors, when you're amplifying these voices that haven't been allowed to sing in history books or in, even in historical novels. I mean, I don't know of any historical novel where you have two voices of a Black, soldier and a Jewish soldier, a white Jewish abolitionist and a woman in Louisiana who's creating maps. They're very unique characters. Their experiences are still relevant today, unfortunately. And so in a way, it gave Shaunna and I a channel to to put our feelings about what we're experiencing now as women in the 21st century, and seeing certain things that we feel need to be corrected, and also a feeling of, can we find a way through this path of darkness into light? Can we find something that connects us rather than dividing us? Can we heal after great tragedy? And I've in other episodes with Shaunna, she said, like, we've come on the other side, come out of the Civil War. So I have hope that at this time in history, we will also come out on the other side. And I think this endeavor that we embarked on was to bring hope to these characters and to ourselves.
Without getting too political, just how important is it for students today to know all of our history? Because again, from your perspective, Ms. Richman, as well as yours, Ms. Edwards, there's that deep family connections that you all have made. And you see as the song from The Facts of Life goes, you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have it. So how important is it for us to know all of our history, not just the good things that we definitely want to highlight, but we also need to take note of and embrace the not so good things, that aspects of our family histories as well?
I think it's incredibly important. One of the things that Alyson and I agreed on was that we were not going to sugarcoat history. We were going to tell the real incidents that happened. And also, I think, for me, as a Black woman, one of the most challenging aspects of history is how much has slid away from us, because perhaps we have only a history of oral storytelling, right? When there were laws against us reading and against us writing. I wish that I could go back and find a substantial amount of documentation of my great progenitors, but I can't. And there's a reason for that, because if you are able to tell the story, to share the history, that's power too. So one of the ways that you take people's power away from them is you prevent them from telling their stories. Now, Black people are wonderful, and so we found other ways. Even the quilts that I have from my family, that my great-grandmother and my grandmother made, those are stories too. The recipes that are handed down are stories. My mother's ability to tell me about, I think it was her great-great-aunt, Janie, who inspires one of the characters in our novel. She might not know all of the facts. She might not have the census records, but that's passed down. And I think that we have to continue to do that. So it is right, like the good, the bad, the ugly, we have to share it all. And I do hope, without getting political, that no matter where people's views and perspectives are, they come to embrace the idea that we can't run from history, and that we can't allow our youth to be shielded from history.
And I just want to add to that. I think, it was so important for us to explore not just the darkness, but also the humanity that binds us to each other. And, both Shaunna and I are, we have had great education. We're really blessed that our families really encouraged that. And we had all these resources growing up that, we read a lot, we traveled a lot, we had amazing teachers and professors. But if I can just give you an example of my education and how there were things I didn't learn, that I didn't process in the same way that I was forced to process when I was writing this book, that really transformed me. So, for example, in history class, when I learned about slavery, I would have learned that an enslaved person wasn't allowed to marry, and they weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. And I would have read over that, and it would have kind of I think it just wouldn't have really set deep into my mind. I would have memorized the fact, but not truly understood what that meant. When we were creating the characters of Stella and William, these two, Black people who love each other so deeply and aren't allowed to marry, that hit home in a way that I never could have experienced when I was reading it in a history book. When there was a scene where William wants to write something to his beloved and he doesn't know how to write, I understood in such a profound way that I'm going to cry. I didn't understand, and it forced me to really process the history, because now those characters were alive for me. And so I think when someone reads The Thread Collectors, they're going to have a similar experience. I might have known that, but I didn't know it. I couldn't feel it. My heart wasn't tethered to, you need to walk in the footsteps of someone. to understand it. I mean, I have a book that I've written in the past that deals with the Holocaust, and I have readers all the time. I have readers in like Poland and Romania, Macedonia saying, my grandmother never wanted to talk about the war, but now I have a deep feeling of how the Jewish people suffered. I remember reading Tia Miles' book, All That She Carried, which is about Ashley Sack and her trying to reconstruct the creation of this sack for a mother for her daughter as she's just about to be separated from her in a time of slavery, and calling Shaunna and saying, this to me reads like a Holocaust book, the fact that mothers and children were being separated, that parents were being shackled in front of their children and sold off, never to see them again. And she said to me, of course it does. But I had to go through the process of myself of learning and, applying it to this story to understand it in that deep, profound way. And I hope readers will experience that as well. The same sort of things that you might read a sentence in history and not pause enough to understand what it means. But when you're walking in the footsteps of a character that you're rooting for and that you love, you're going to feel it and never forget.
We know that when you read something, depending on what your particular station in life is at the time when you read it, it hits you a different way. And so that's why when you read a book several times, each time you notice something a little bit different about it because of where you are and what you've been through in your own life. But now I want to address the future writers. Thinking about the future writers or even students who are looking for a way to just kind of process everything that's going on in their own lives. Because what I get from our conversation today is that writing this book has been very transformative and cathartic for both of you. And so how can doing historical fiction like this help today's student process and deal with what's going on in their lives and dealing with everything that's going on around them?
Hey, Kevin, that's an incredible question. And I will say, because this was my first novel, I put a lot of pressure on myself. I thought the story had to be perfect, right? And what I've now come to realize, and what I think is the most helpful part about writing, is the story just has to be true. It just has to be true to you. And so there are so many times I'm not blessed enough to be a mother, but I'm a bonus mom to three stepsons. And when they talk to me about what they're going through in the world, a lot of what I hear from them is people don't understand my perspective. You don't understand what I'm going through as a young Black man. And having the courage and really just being able to put down what is true to you and read those words, frankly, even if you don't share it, but better if you share it, I think allows you to understand it a little bit more, to recognize that your story has validity, Alyson's story has validity, my story has validity, and it's okay if it's not perfect. And as long as it's true to you, then it has value. So I'm a big believer of use the words to kind of process what you're moving through.
Alyson, you have one that you want to add to that?
I absolutely agree with Shaunna that, it's the perspective that we learn from another person, bringing that to our life, enriching us. It just, I think, helps make the world a better place. My mother has this saying that only, a painting is great if it's interesting from all different directions. And so with writing this book, it was about showing all these unique perspectives on something that many people think they know enough about the Civil War, but there's so much more to be learned, and changing different angles of telling that story, seeing it from a different lens, a Black lens, a Jewish lens, underrepresented lens that you haven't seen, the portal into how they experience that story, I think is going to enrich people and make it so that hopefully that we show the bridge that connects us rather than the bridge that divides us.
We would definitely like to thank our guests today, the authors of the historical fiction book, The Thread Collectors, Alyson Richman and Shaunna J. Edwards, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much.
And once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.